there, and welcome to part 4 of the ABCs of board game design. If you haven't seen part 1, 2, and 3, I'll link them in the description below and also have links up in the corner. Today we're going to go through board game design related terms that start from the letters S to Z. And yes, I am Canadian. If you're new to my channel, my name is Pam. I'm a board game designer and I talk about all things board game design here on this channel. So let's start with the letter S. Sleeves. These are little pouches that board game designers or gamers put their cards in to prevent them from being damaged or to easily swap them out. When you're prototyping a game, these can make shuffling your cards a lot easier, so you don't have to print your prototype on nice thick cardstock. You can just use very cheap index cards or computer paper or scrap paper and then slide them into a sleeve, and that will provide some structure to your cards and will also hide the cards so you can't see through them and makes shuffling of the cards easier. This is something that I don't do as a designer. I just don't have the patience to put cards into sleeves, take them out, put them in, take them out. Like, when I'm updating the cards so often, I just don't have the patience for that. I do know that it's most likely a good investment. So I do have card sleeves on my Amazon to buy list. It's probably something I'll be adding to my prototyping supplies. It's not necessary, but it is a nice thing to have. Sandbox games. These are games that have the same sort of feel as open world video games or adventure style video games, where there are a lot of options and different things you can do on your turn, different places you can explore, different things you can try, and it's really up to you just to decide what you're going to do on your turn. Personally, I love adventure style video games, so I have designed some sandboxy style games. One was based on the Three Musketeers and I really enjoyed it. Nothing ended up happening with it, but I might bring it back someday. Some examples of sandbox games include Runebound and Western Legends. So they're called sandbox games because the idea is it's kind of like you're in a sandbox, you're a kid playing a sandbox and you're digging around and discovering different things and exploring. Set collection. This is when you collect groups based off a common factor and you gain points for grouping them together. For example, in Sushi Go, if you collect 1 dumpling card, that's 1 point. But if you collect 2 dumplings, that's 3 points. Then 6 points for 3 dumplings, 10 points for 4 dumplings, and 15 points for 5 dumplings. Many games use this mechanic, and some examples include Jaipur, Wreck Raiders, and Seven Wonders Duel. Social deduction. These are games where players are trying to figure out who's who, usually based on asking people questions, bluffing answers, trying to convince people that you are something that you're not. So it's a lot of trying to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not. Ultimately, the majority of the players are usually trying to find the traitor or the murderer or the werewolf, and then the murderer, traitor, werewolf is trying to not be detected. Examples include Deception, Murder in Hong Kong, Spyfall, and One Night Ultimate Werewolf. Serpentine. This is a way that you can select resources or cards in a game. For example, in Catan, the first player places one of their settlements on the board. Then the next player places one of their settlements, and if it's a 4-player game, the 4th player, the last player to place one of their settlements, then would place another settlement. So they would place 2 in a row. Then it would go back around the circle counterclockwise. So the 3rd player would place, the 2nd player would place, and then the player who went first would then finally place their 2nd settlement. This is a way to try to balance out who goes first and who goes last. The first player gets the advantage of going first and placing their settlement first on an open board, but then they have to wait for the turn to get all the way back around to them to finally place their 2nd settlement. The player who places their settlement last gets the benefit of placing another one immediately. Spiel de Jahres. I have no idea if I'm saying that right. I actually Googled how to pronounce this and that's the best I can do. This means Game of the Year in German. So this is an award that's given out to any game that has been released in Germany within the past year. So many publishers will make sure that they have a German release so they can be considered for the Spiel des Jahres. Even though it is a German award, it really is seen as the top award to receive in board game design. They have different categories including family-friendly games, more complex strategy games, and kids games. So as a board game designer, this is the ultimate award that you would love to receive one day. Solo variant. A lot of games are doing this now, where their player count will be 1 to 5 or 1 to 4 or whatever, to allow players to play the game on their own if they want to, and also gives people an opportunity to learn how to play the game before they then have other people play it with them. But it is true, it can be tough to find people to play games with on a consistent basis, and so I think it's great that games can offer a solo variant to the game. This is a trend that I hope continues, and more designers think about how they can incorporate a solo variant into their games. T, Tabletop Simulator, or TTS. This is an online platform that people can use to create digital prototypes of their games. You can buy this program on Steam for around $22 Canadian. You then have to learn how to set up your files and upload your files onto Tabletop Simulator to create a digital prototype. Then you can invite people from all over the world to play test your game online. This became very popular during COVID when people couldn't go out and see each other. So that is when I learned how to use Tabletop Simulator, and I had some games up on there. I definitely prefer to play test in person, but this is a fantastic option to have to also play test with people who aren't local to you. Take that. This is a mechanic that involves players negatively affecting their opponents, whether that's stealing cards, forcing players to discard some of their cards, or losing health, or any other negative impact on their opponents. I'm not a huge fan of this mechanic as a gamer and a designer. I know that some people really enjoy it, and it can be really fun with the right group, but I prefer to outplay my opponents and not just steal from them. So some examples include Exploding Kittens and Uno. Trading. This is a mechanic that offers players the option of trading cards or resources with each other, usually in addition to a market. Both players will need to feel like they're both benefiting from the trade in order for it to happen. So I know for me and my friends, when we play games like Settlers of Catan, there isn't a lot of trading happening because we usually feel like the trade will benefit the player asking for the trade more than us. And we would rather force them to use the market instead. So examples include Catan and Bonanza. Trading card game, or TCG. This is also known as a collectible card game, or CCG. This is a style of game that was introduced with Magic the Gathering. And the idea is that players begin with the starter deck of cards. They can then buy more booster sets or trade with other players to build up their collection of cards. So players will eventually have like a library of cards, and then they'll decide from their library which cards they want to pull from to create a deck before playing another player. So players will build their decks from their collection, usually with powerful card combinations in mind. They want to build a deck that will give them the best chance of beating their opponent. Turn order. There are many different ways to determine turn order in a game. The standard is just moving around a circle clockwise. Usually, the first player will then rotate after a round. But in some games, the first player will always stay the first player unless another player uses an action to then become the first player. That is used in the game Safranito and Agricola, where players can use an action to become the first player until another player uses an action to become the first player. And then there are other ways that turn order is determined as more of a catch-up mechanism. The idea is to help players that are possibly falling a little behind to catch up to the leader. One example is using a time track. For example, in Patchwork. This is where a player will continue to take turns until they're no longer the furthest behind on the time track. So by time track, I just mean track. So for example, if one player is very far ahead on the track, they have to sit there and wait until other players have taken enough turns and moved far enough on the track that they're now ahead. Now that player can go again. And then there's games like Brass Birmingham that use what is called a stat-based turn order, meaning the player who spent the most money on their turn will go last the next round. So there are lots of different and interesting ways that you can determine turn order in your games. Tapping a card. This term originated from Magic the Gathering, and it means rotating a card 90 degrees to indicate that it has been spent. Normally at the start of the next round, you will untap it to show that it's available to use again. I use this action when playing different games such as Wordsy to show that I've counted up points for that card and that card and that card and so on. One interesting thing to note is that Wizards of the Coast, who published Magic the Gathering, patented the mechanic of tapping. That patent has since expired, but still a lot of people are hesitant of using the word tap or tapping in their games for fear that they might be sued by Wizards of the Coast. So if you use tapping in your game, just call it something else, like rotate or exhaust or use, or something like that. Tile placement. These are games where players strategically place tiles onto the play area in ways to earn points or resources. Examples include Carcassonne, Quirkle, and Scrabble. End game trigger. This is something that happens that will trigger the end of the game, but what happens after the trigger can be different. So let's say, for example, once any player collects 8 cards, that will trigger the end of the game. So what would you say that happens after that? You could say that the game ends immediately, or maybe you'll allow players to finish the round. So say the second player triggered the end of the game, they will then allow the third and fourth player to finish their turns. They wouldn't let the first player go again. They would just finish the round and then they would count up the points. Or possibly you might let everyone have one more turn before the end of the game. U, uncertainty. It's definitely good to have uncertainty in your games. You definitely want to feel like you have a chance of winning right up until the end of the game. And an element of uncertainty is necessary for that to happen. But if all information is available, you can quite easily figure out if you have a chance of winning or not. So having some elements hidden, some elements unknown, some elements random will help keep the interest of the players of your game. But you don't want to have so much uncertainty that the players have absolutely no idea what's going on and where they might stand in the game. So it's a delicate balance similar to luck. You want to have a bit of luck, but not so much that it's completely random. I read an interesting book called Uncertainty in Games and would recommend reading it if this topic interests you. To chill. I think I'll probably cut all that out. It's fine. V, victory points or VP. This is the standard terminology for points that you need to win the game. I remember when I first got into this, people would say VP and I had no idea what they were talking about, so it's just something to know. It just means points. Voting. This is a mechanic used in games, usually social deduction games, where players will vote if they think they know who is the traitor. It's used in games including One Night Ultimate Werewolf and Dead of Winter. Multiple paths to victory. These are games where there are several different ways that you can win. For example, in Seven Wonders Duel, you can win by military supremacy, so that's pushing your opponent so far back along the military track that you win. Scientific supremacy, meaning you've gained 6 different science tokens. Or civilian victory, which is having the most VP. This can be really interesting because it allows players to pivot in the middle of games. If they feel like one path isn't working out for them, they can change course and pursue a different path to victory. Players can also attempt a different strategy each game to try out the different paths to victory. So this can increase the replayability of a game and also increase players' engagement with a game. It is an interesting concept, but some people feel that it makes the game overly complicated and fuzzy. But it's definitely a cool concept to explore. W, worker placement. This is one of my favorite mechanics. It involves a player placing one of their workers, or just a meeple, on an action space that is available to all players. Now, no other player can do that action. Or if there is an additional space on that action, it's a less powerful form of that action. But the idea of blocking other players from doing certain things is a central concept to this mechanic. After players have taken turns placing their workers on different action spaces on the board, they will then do those actions and then bring all of their workers back. Examples of games that use worker placement are Lords of Waterdeep, Agricola, and Istanbul. The weight of a game. When people say they're playing a light game or a medium game or a heavy game, they're talking about the complexity of the game. If it's light, it's fairly easy, straightforward, family-friendly, kid-friendly. If it's medium or heavy, it's getting more complicated, more options for the players, more complicated concepts, and usually you need to have some basic knowledge of different mechanics and of different games to be able to jump into a medium or heavy game. It usually correlates with how long games are as well. Heavy games can take hours to play, medium like hour, 2 hours, light is usually less than an hour. Win condition. This is how you determine the winner of a game. You might add a bunch of different things up, otherwise known as point salad, or maybe it's the first to reach the end of a track, or maybe it's just straight points, maybe there's a hidden goal, maybe there's a lot of math involved like Seven Wonders, or maybe it's just very simple. Usually the lighter, more friendly and party games should have a fairly clear and straightforward win condition. And then the heavier games, it's alright if it can take some time to add up all the points at the end. X, 4X, meaning explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. This is a term mainly used in video games, but also used in some board games. So these are games that usually include controlling areas and territories and resources and building up empires. Players will usually control different factions or races, trying to gain supremacy of that world. An example of this style of game would be Scythe. Why? You choose, I cut. You might know that it's actually called I cut, you choose, but I couldn't think of any other Y words. So in this style of game, one player takes on the role of separating or grouping the different resources on the table. Then the other players will take turns choosing one of the groups that the first player made. So I cut, I will make the different groupings, you then choose one of them. So the player that's cutting is trying to make the groupings not super desirable, but they also don't want to make one really, really terrible option because that will then most likely be left for them. An example of this style of game is New York Slice. Zed, zero-sum game. There aren't too many board games that are true zero-sum games, but the best example of a card game is poker. So the idea of a zero-sum game means that the number of points available is the same at the beginning as they are at the end, but the distribution is different. Meaning, in a poker game, the winner has gained all of the chips from their opponent. So now they have all the chips, all of their opponents have 0. It's the same number of chips that the game started with, but now one player has all of them, everyone else has 0. All right, now that's it. That is it for A to Z of the ABCs of board game design. I hope you enjoyed this series. I really did. I even learned some things that I didn't know before. So if you enjoyed this video, I hope that you like and subscribe. And let me know what other board game design topics you'd like me to cover in the comments below. Be sure to follow me on social media at Pam Walls Game Design, and I'll see you in the next video.